So you're fighting for a spot in the fantasy playoffs, and of course, 6 teams are on bye in week 13, and all of them have at least one highly important fantasy asset. You need to make some crucial decisions as we head into the weekend. I'm Jorden Hill, and today we're going to be taking a look at RotoBaller's consensus half PPR rankings for Sunday and Monday's games, going into further detail about some of the more interesting names listed. We'll dive right in, but first, please remember to leave a like on this video, and go ahead and drop a comment down below with any start-sit questions you may have. Let's get things started at the quarterback position with number 12, Jared Goff. Goff struggled a bit on Thanksgiving Day, but still managed to turn in a decent performance as the Lions fought to make a comeback in the second half. He has a relatively difficult matchup this week against the Saints, who have allowed the 11th fewest fantasy points per game to quarterbacks on the season, but have been much more vulnerable recently. With the Lions scoring nearly 27 points per contest, Goff is pretty much locked in as an every-week starter, and he's especially viable this week with the likes of Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, and Justin Fields all on bye. We'll now move up to number 8 to talk about Russell Wilson. He hasn't been vintage Seattle Russ by any means, but Wilson has been surprisingly consistent this season, scoring at least 14 fantasy points in 9 of 11 starts. He'll face the Houston Texans this week, who allow the 6th most passing yards per contest. Houston's offense has been hot, and Denver is on a 5-game winning streak, so expect this to be a close fight in which Wilson should succeed for fantasy. And all the way up at number 2, we have Tua Tagovailoa. Tua didn't do much in week 12, so you may be wondering how he's ranked above Patrick Mahomes this week. Well, on Black Friday, Tagovailoa took on the Jets, one of the toughest defenses in the league, but this week he gets the Commanders, who have surrendered the most passing touchdowns, most fantasy points per game, and second most yards to opposing quarterbacks. Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle should have a field day with the secondary, so you can have a ton of confidence in Tua as your QB1. Moving over to our running back rankings, at number 9 we have Rachaad White. White has been really solid for fantasy this year, as he is seeing almost all of the work out of Tampa Bay's backfield. He's been especially productive in plus matchups, and this week's matchup is about as favorable as it gets. The Carolina Panthers have allowed the most rushing touchdowns and the 3rd most fantasy points per game to running backs. Mike Evans is obviously still a quality start, but Carolina has been shockingly good against quarterbacks and wide receivers, so this game has Rachaad White explosion written all over it. With the unfortunate news of Jonathan Taylor's thumb injury, Week 2 waiver wire darling and our number 8 running back this week, Zach Moss, should step right back into the workhorse role that he held early on in the season. From weeks 2 through 6, Moss was the fantasy RB4, averaging over 19 half PPR points per game. He'll return to fantasy relevance against the Titans, who he destroyed back in week 5 for 195 total yards and 2 trips to the end zone. Whether you've been stashing him for weeks or just grabbed him off waivers, Moss should instantly enter your starting lineup. Up at number 4 is Kyren Williams. Williams returned from IR last week and picked up right where he left off in week 6, delivering a fantasy RB1 performance with over 200 total yards and 2 receiving touchdowns. This was against the Cardinals, however, and he has a much more difficult challenge on Sunday against the Cleveland Browns. Luckily, this game is in LA, and Cleveland's defense hasn't been quite as dominant on the road. I wouldn't expect Williams to post 35 fantasy points again this week, but he's been so great and so involved when healthy that he remains a must start. Let's take a look at our wide receiver rankings, starting with number 9, Tank Dell. Dell has been dealing with a calf injury, but returned to practice on Thursday, which is a great sign for his availability against the Broncos. Denver has been incredibly stout against opposing wide receivers, allowing the fewest fantasy points to the position over the past 4 weeks. Still, Dell has scored in 4 consecutive games, and this contest has a healthy projected point total. His chemistry with CJ Stroud has been undeniable, and the duo should keep rolling. Coming in at number 5 is A.J. Brown, who managed to find the end zone last week, but has otherwise been pretty underwhelming since the Eagles' Week 10 bye. What's interesting is that Devonta Smith has been better for fantasy purposes, and there seems to be significant correlation between Smith's success and Dallas Goedert being inactive. Regardless, Brown could go off for 150 plus yards on any given Sunday, so why not in a possible shootout against the 49ers? San Francisco is allowing the 11th most fantasy points to wideouts, so both Eagles receivers find themselves inside our top 12. Kicking off our top 3 is Keenan Allen. Allen hasn't been practicing this week as he nurses a quadriceps injury, so it'll be very important to monitor his status heading into the weekend. He has a soft matchup against the Patriots, who allow the 9th most fantasy points per game to receivers. Allen has been so necessary to the Chargers, earning at least 14 targets and tallying over 100 yards in 3 straight games. This new injury is definitely concerning, but if he's healthy enough to play, you gotta play him. And finally, we have our tight end rankings. In his second game back from a hamstring injury and his first game without Matt Canada running the offense, Pat Freiermuth turned 11 targets into 9 receptions for 120 yards. He comes in at number 8 against the Arizona Cardinals, who have been decent against fantasy tight ends this year, but did just allow Tyler Higbee to score twice in Week 12. We'll have to see if Pittsburgh's offense can keep progressing, but either way, Freiermuth was a top target for Kenny Pickett last year and should continue to produce now that he's healthy. Up one spot at number 7 is Evan Ingram. I was surprised to learn that Ingram hasn't scored a touchdown yet this season, but his target share has been about as consistent as you could ask for, as he's received at least 5 opportunities in every game. He'll face the Bengals on Monday night, who have surrendered the second most fantasy points per game to tight ends. It was Cincinnati that just gave up 120 yards to Pat Freiermuth last week, so Ingram should be able to feast against this defense, especially with how good the Jags have looked on offense recently. And coming in at number 5 is Taysom Hill. Hill is always in play as a dart throw, but he could be in line for increased work this week with Michael Thomas out, Rashid Shaheed likely out, and Chris Olave highly questionable to go against the Lions. You may have noticed that Juwan Johnson also snuck into our top 10, and this was for the same reasons. Hill doesn't usually operate as your typical tight end, but Detroit has been vulnerable to the position, and both of these guys should get a handful of touches with how depleted the Saints receiving core is. Hope you guys enjoyed. Please don't forget to subscribe to RotoBaller for all the latest fantasy football content that'll help you win big in 2023. Thanks so much for tuning in, and best of luck in your Week 13 fantasy matchups.